I dropped my lasgun on the first day, not in a firefight, during inspection, right in front of Commissar Thane, because my hands were shaking so badly from the cold on the parade ground at Castra Sonnen that the rifle just slid straight out of my fingers and clattered off the stone, loud enough that 11,000 other new recruits standing in formation flinched at the same time. Thane didn't shout. He picked the weapon up himself, checked the las cell, wiped the frost off the barrel with his own glove, and only then looked at me. He said that on Cadia, a dropped weapon was the last mistake a man ever got to make twice. Then he made me hold the rifle above my head for the rest of the inspection, while my arms burned and my name got written into a logbook that, as far as the Departamento Munitorum was concerned, was the only proof I had ever existed at all. Alexei Bran, son of a woman who packed ammunition crates for a living, in a tenement block that never once saw direct sunlight, and a father I never met and never asked about, because on Cadia, you learned early not to ask questions that led nowhere. By the time the inspection ended, my arms had gone past burning into a kind of numbness I would get used to, in one form or another, for the rest of my life. I want you to remember that dropped rifle, because everything else that happened to me traces back to that one freezing morning, and it comes back again before the end. Here is the thing nobody tells you about being conscripted into the Astra Militarum. It isn't a decision. On a fortress world like Cadia, roughly 1 in every 10 children born is registered for military service before they can walk, and the Departamento Munitorum does not ask twice. I turned 12, a Scolum officer with ink-stained fingers stamped a form without once looking up from his desk, and my mother signed underneath it, because refusing to sign was itself a crime with its own paperwork. She didn't cry in front of the officer. She waited until we were back in the tenement stairwell, out of sight of anyone who might file a report on a citizen showing insufficient enthusiasm for the war effort, and then she held my face in both hands for exactly as long as it took to say that Cadia had never once given anyone back what it took, and that I should stop expecting it to start with me. By the time I was 14, I was standing in a line 3 kilometers long, waiting to be issued a uniform that had been worn by at least 2 men before me, judging by the 2 different names still faintly stitched into the collar. The quartermaster didn't apologize for that. He just told me the previous owners weren't using it anymore, which on Cadia is the closest thing to a joke you're likely to hear from a man whose entire job is counting boots. Training lasted 11 months, and the point of it, I understood eventually, was not to make me brave, it was to make me identical. Every guardsman on Cadia drills the same march, holds the same weapon the same way, recites the same litany before meals, until an entire regiment moves like a single machine with 40,000 moving parts, because a machine like that can lose 9,000 of those parts in an afternoon and keep functioning. There was a boy in my training cohort named Uris who couldn't march in step no matter how many times the drill sergeant corrected him, and rather than waste more time on him, they simply reassigned him to a labor battalion loading shells, which everyone understood to mean the same fate delivered more slowly and with less dignity. I was lasgun number 88 Delta 4 before I was Alexei Bran to most of the men who outranked me, and I stopped finding that strange faster than I expected to. There is a kind of comfort in being interchangeable. Nobody grieves apart. They just requisition another one. My first posting wasn't a war zone at all. It was garrison duty on a mining outpost called Harrow's Reach, guarding a Prometheum pumping station against absolutely nothing for the better part of 2 years. And I want to tell you that sounds like luck, but boredom on Cadia has its own specific cruelty. There is only so much boot polish a man can apply to boots nobody will ever see mud on. I learned to play a card game called Regicide from a trooper twice my age who'd lost 3 fingers on his left hand to frostbite and could still shuffle a deck faster than I could deal one, and I learned that the fastest way to make 2 years disappear is to stop asking anyone, including yourself, what any of it was for. When the transfer orders finally came through, half the garrison actually cheered, which tells you something about which was worse, the waiting or the thing we were waiting for. Every regiment on Cadia marches with an attached priest of the ecclesiarchy, and I want to be honest about what that actually meant day to day, because the recruitment posters and the reality were two different documents entirely. Confessor Ilyanov led us in the same litany before every meal, every drop, and every burial, and by my third year, I could recite it in my sleep without believing a single line of it, which, as far as I could tell, put me in the majority rather than the minority. That isn't blasphemy. It's just what happens to faith when you've watched it fail to stop a single lasbolt, a single collapsed dugout, a single form with 4 words on it. What I did believe in, without ever once being able to explain why, was Osip's hand on my rifle stock, and the man on my left, and the man on my right, and I have come to think that on Cadia, that was the only religion that ever actually held up under fire. Confessor Ilyanov himself would probably have called that heresy. He died at Corundel before I could ever ask him. The food deserves its own mention, because if you ever wonder what an empire spanning 1 million worlds spends its logistics budget on, it apparently is not flavor. The standard issue ration bar tasted like compressed cardboard that had been lightly threatened with a vegetable, and the joke in my platoon, the only joke that survived 11 months of training intact, was that the Munitorum classified it as food, the same way it classified a lasgun as a fashion accessory, which is to say technically, and only on paperwork nobody read. A trooper named Voss used to trade 3 ration bars for a single mouthful of real bread whenever a supply officer got careless, and considered it the best deal available anywhere in the Imperium. We ate the bars 3 times a day for a decade. I have genuinely forgotten what an apple tastes like. They shipped us out on a troop transport called the Vigilant Oath, 40,000 of us packed into a hull built to move ammunition more than men, and the voyage took 6 weeks, during which absolutely nothing was explained to anyone below the rank of major. Men prayed in shifts near the chapel deck, because the deck itself was too small to hold more than 200 at a time, and a rumor went around in week 3 that the Geller field had flickered during a warp squall, which nobody could confirm, and everybody chose to believe anyway, because believing something specific was easier than sitting with the alternative, which was simply not knowing what was on the other side of the hull plating. We didn't know which war zone we were bound for until the drop pods were already loading. That is not an oversight. The Munitorum has learned, over 10,000 years of continuous warfare, that a guardsman who knows too far in advance where he's going to die has too much time to think about it, and a guardsman who thinks too much becomes a guardsman who hesitates, and hesitation kills the man standing next to him faster than it kills him. We landed on a world called Verdant's Hollow, which despite the name was mostly grey rock and grey rain, defending a Prometheum refinery against an Ork invasion that outnumbered us roughly 6 to 1. I want to be precise about what that number means, because it isn't an abstraction when you're the one holding the line. It means that for every guardsman still breathing by nightfall, 6 greenskins had been killed to get him there, and it also means that somewhere in that math was a version of the war where I simply wasn't one of the 6 who made it. My first actual shot in anger missed by enough distance that the trooper beside me laughed out loud in the middle of an active firefight, which I did not find funny at the time and find slightly funny now. I found out I was afraid of dying in a very specific and unglamorous way. My hands shook exactly like they had on that first morning at Kassersonnen, and the trooper next to me, a Valhallan transfer named Osip, who'd been in 3 campaigns already, just put his hand flat on my rifle stock until it steadied and said nothing at all, because there was nothing useful to say. There was exactly 1 good week in my first 4 years of service, and I want to tell you about it, because it's easy to make a life like mine sound like nothing but mud and forms, and that isn't quite honest either. After Verdant's Hollow was declared secure, the regiment was granted 6 days of furlough on a garden world 2 systems over, a place with actual green grass and a sky that wasn't the color of a bruise, and Osip and I spent most of it doing absolutely nothing, which after 4 years of doing something every waking hour felt like the most extravagant luxury either of us had ever been offered. We ate fruit that wasn't a ration bar. Osip cried the first time he bit into it, and then denied it, and then admitted it, and we never spoke of it again, which was as close as either of us came to sentiment in 4 years of fighting side by side. I think about that week more than I think about most of the battles. It is strange what the mind decides to keep. Osip became the closest thing I had to family for the next 4 years. He taught me to sleep sitting upright with my boots still laced, to tell the difference between incoming artillery and outgoing by the pitch of the whistle, and to never, under any circumstances, let a commissar see you flinch, because flinching in front of an authority whose primary job is executing cowardice on the spot tends to be interpreted generously in the moment you least want generosity. I watched that lesson taught in person only once. A trooper named Feodor broke and ran during a bombardment at a supply depot near Verdansk Hollow's eastern ridge, made it maybe 40 meters, and Commissar Thane, the same one from the parade ground, reassigned to our regiment 8 months in, walked out into open ground under fire to do it himself, rather than send anyone else, because as far as Thane was concerned, an execution delegated to a subordinate was an execution done badly. Nobody in the company spoke about it afterward, which was its own kind of agreement about what had happened. I watched that same man polish his boots to a mirror shine during an artillery barrage that had already killed 6 of the guardsmen standing near him, purely, as far as I could tell, because a commissar with dull boots was a worse crime in his mind than an orc breaching the wire. I need to stop the story here for a moment, because I think it's easy to hear all this and file it away as something that happens to characters in a setting, at a safe distance from you. It isn't safe, and it isn't distant, and that's the actual point. Somewhere right now, in the fiction this comes from, there is a person exactly like Osip, exactly like Alexei Bran, standing in mud that has not dried in 6 weeks, holding a weapon that jams if you don't clean it, with a rag that's more whole than fabric, doing the single most unglamorous job in the entire Imperium, which is simply refusing to move when moving means the line collapses. Nobody writes ballads about that. There are no statues of the guardsman who held a trench for 11 hours and then died there anonymously, next to 11 other men whose names are also not on any statue. The Space Marines get the poems, the Guard gets the body count. And the strange part is that most of the men holding that line know it, and dig in anyway, because the alternative isn't heroism or cowardice. It's just the man on your left and the man on your right, and neither of them deserves to hold the trench alone. Osip died 3 years after Verdansk Hollow, at a siege the official record calls Drennan's Folly, and every guardsman who was there calls something considerably less official. He didn't die dramatically. He died pulling a wounded trooper out of a collapsed dugout when a second shell landed on the same position, and I was close enough to see it happen, and too far to do anything about it, which is a distance I have thought about more than almost anything else in my life. I filled out the paperwork myself this time. There is an enormous amount of paperwork involved in dying on Cadia, or surviving next to men who did, casualty logs, ammunition reconciliation forms, requisition requests for replacement boots, stripped off the dead, because boots, unlike men, are considered reusable. I filled out 14 forms that first week, confirming Osip's death for a records clerk on a World 3 warp jumps away, who would never once meet either of us, and the last line of the form asked me to state, in 20 words or fewer, the deceased's contribution to the campaign. I wrote that he taught a frightened boy how to hold a rifle steady, and the clerk's stamp came back a week later, having cut it down to 4 words, for filing purposes: adequate, standard, non-notable service. By my 7th year, I had been promoted twice, transferred 3 times, and buried enough friends that I stopped learning the names of new transfers until they'd survived their first engagement, because learning a name too early just meant one more form to fill out later. I broke that rule exactly once, for a nervous 17-year-old named Petrenko, who reminded me enough of myself at Verdansk Hollow that I couldn't help it, and I taught him the same 2 things Osip had taught me: how to tell incoming from outgoing by the whistle, and how to keep his hands steady on a rifle stock, even when the rest of him wasn't steady at all. He survived his first 3 engagements, which by Cadian standards made him a veteran, and the last time I saw him, he was teaching the same lesson to someone even younger, which is as close to an afterlife as anything gets in the Astra Militarum. I fought at a hive world called Corindel, a forge moon whose name I never actually learned to spell correctly, for the better part of 11 months, grinding street by street through a manufactorum district that had already changed hands 4 times before we ever arrived. It was there that Confessor Ilyanov died, crushed under a support column he'd gone back into a burning chapel to save nobody in particular, and it was there that I first understood that Cadia's enemies weren't always green or spiked. Sometimes they were simply attrition, and hunger, and a supply line that had been cut for 6 weeks, and the slow arithmetic of a company that started at 200 men and finished at 31. We held it. Nobody outside the regiment ever learned the name Corindel, and I have made my peace with that, because by then I understood that most of what the Guard does is exactly this: unglamorous, uncounted, and necessary regardless. And finally, I fought at the defense of the Cadian Gate itself, when the 13th Great Invasion out of the Eye of Terror finally came for the fortress world I'd been born on. I was 31 years old, which on Cadia made me one of the old men in my company. The last day went like this. We were dug into a trench line outside Casa Dirth, close enough to Casa Sonnen that on a clear morning I could sometimes see the old training grounds where I'd dropped my rifle 17 years earlier, and the artillery had not stopped for 4 days straight, and Chaos Space Marines were coming through a breach in the outer wall that 4 regiments had already died trying to close. Petrenko was 2 positions down the line from me, and I remember being grateful for that, and hating myself slightly for being grateful, because it meant I was measuring the battle by whether he lived through it, rather than by anything larger. My hands were shaking again, not from cold this time. I was 31, and my hands were doing exactly what they'd done at 14, and I found that strangely comforting instead of humiliating, because it meant some part of me was still the same boy the Commissar had made hold a rifle over his head for an entire inspection, and that boy had survived 17 years he had no right to survive. Commissar Thane was 3 positions up the line from me when the breach finally opened, close enough that I heard him give the order to hold with exactly the same flat, unhurried voice he'd used on a parade ground 17 years earlier, as if the 2 moments were somehow the same size to him. I never found out what happened to him after that, and I've decided I'd rather not know, because in my head he is still standing there giving that order, and that seemed like a fairer ending than whatever the actual one turned out to be. Petrenko I did see, once, in the smoke between 2 artillery falls, close enough to shout his name, and he shouted mine back, and that was the entire conversation, and it was somehow enough. I want to tell you I felt brave in that trench. Mostly I felt 31 years old and very tired, and I thought, in no particular order, about my mother's hands on my face in a stairwell, and about an apple I couldn't remember the taste of, and about Osip's hand on my rifle stock the first time it ever shook. I don't know if I killed the traitor who killed me. I remember firing. I remember the trench wall, and Osip's old advice about incoming versus outgoing whistles, and I remember thinking, with something closer to relief than fear, that at least this time I hadn't dropped the rifle. It stayed in my hands the entire way down. They didn't recover my body. Cadia fell 3 days later. The whole fortress world along with it turned into a graveyard the size of a planet, and every casa I had ever known, Sonnen, Dirth, all of them, went with it, along with the parade ground where a boy once dropped his rifle in front of 11,000 people and lived to hear about it for 17 more years. I don't know what happened to Petrenko. I don't know if the 6 days of green grass on that garden world meant as much to Osip in his last moment as they did in mine. I don't know if anyone ever told my mother anything more specific than a form number. These are the things a life like mine leaves behind instead of a monument. Not silence exactly, just a great many small unanswered questions, scattered across an empire too large to ever collect them back into one place. Somewhere in the Administratum's endless archives On some world that never once felt Cadian rain, there is a form, 4 words long, describing a life that started with a stamped registration document at age 12 and ended holding a line outside Casa d'Earth. Adequate, standard, non-notable service. Not because it was true, but because nobody left alive had the time to write anything longer, for a man who was never meant to be remembered individually in the first place, only counted and replaced the way every guardsman before him had been counted and replaced, going back 10,000 years, one dropped rifle and one held trench at a time. I have made my peace with that too. It is, in the end, exactly the peace Cardia raised me to make.